Torreón Massacre on May 13th, 1911. The Chinese in Torreón. Chinese migrants had arrived to Mexico to work and provide better lives for themselves. The Treaty of Amity of 1899 between Mexico and China allowed many Chinese people to enter and immediately start working on railroads, haciendas, and mines. The Chinese population grew in Mexico during the last quarter of the 19th century, with President Diaz's attempt to develop Mexico by encouraging foreign investment and immigration of colonists and laborers. Politician Kang Yue had invested a lot in Torreón, and this allowed colonies of the Chinese to grow, and in Torreón solely they grew to about 600 people. This was a very peaceful community and encouraged growth within the city. However, it was not liked by all Mexicans. Despite their success, many Chinese suffered persecution in Mexico, and during the earliest 20th century, anti-Chinese laws were enacted. This had prohibited many rights of the Chinese people that they should have had like any other citizen in Mexico. For example, Mexican women were not allowed to be with Chinese men. It was strictly prohibited. The Torreón Massacre. This was an attempt of Francisco Madero's to destroy President Diaz's power in northern Mexico. And during the previous 6 months, Madero and his troops had seized most of the important towns, now being concentrated on Torreón, where federal troops had been protecting the city but withdrew after 2 days for lacking ammunition, allowing the Maderistas to enter Torreón. When Madero's army entered Torreón accompanied by a mob on May 13th, 1911, they had began to terrorize business districts where the people were predominantly Chinese. In 10 hours, hundreds of Chinese people were killed and five Japanese and 303 Chinese. The Japanese were solely killed for having similar features, and the businesses were a major target of the mobs because they had envied them. In this newspaper, there is a brief description about the Torreón Massacre, where they highlight that heads of the murdered Chinese were rolled along the streets and their bodies were tied to the tails of horses. Francisco Madero and Porfirio Diaz. Francisco Madero was a Mexican revolutionary who had unified democratic and anti-Diaz forces to end Diaz's dictatorship. He was a strong believer in moderate forms of democracy and became president in November of 1911. Porfirio Diaz was the president for 31 years, from 1876 to 1911. He had strengthened the export economy through foreign investment. He suppressed oppositions and rigged elections, bribed many to support him to keep himself in power. Aftermath of the massacre. The Chinese government immediately protested the massacre. Madero's military justified the massacre and their actions as a revolution and claimed that the Chinese people had attacked federal troops. The investigation concluded that the Chinese community was peaceful and not at all what they had said. The massacre was ruled as unprovoked and an act of racial hatred. This was an open violation of the treaty with China in 1899, and despite the agreement to pay for all damages, the crimes were unpunished and never fully compensated to China. Many people had fled Torreón after the massacre, and many of them were said to have settled in Guadalajara. Although there is not much of an exhibit exclusively for this massacre, there are some pictures displayed in Mexico City's museum that show Chinese migrants in Torreón. The most recent acknowledgement to this event was that on May 17, 2021, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador had issued a formal apology for what happened to the Chinese people in Torreón. He had stated that the Mexican state will not allow ever again racism or discrimination.